What does it mean to age well, and when do we begin aging well? We believe that aging well begins in childhood, perhaps even before. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we're talking about something few people associate with aging well: bone strength in childhood. The reality is that what happens before puberty, in terms of movement, strength, and nutrition, sets the stage for physical resilience decades down the line. If we want to age well, we have to build strong bones early. The Aging Well podcast encourages informed decision-making and always consult your physician and scientific literature when making decisions about your health.
Dr. Armstrong, when people think about aging and bone health, they usually picture osteoporosis in older adults. Why are you saying it starts in childhood?
Well, I think it's pretty well established that our bone density is developed in our teen years. For women in particular, if you want to reduce the risk of osteoporosis in your advanced years, is do as much weight-bearing activity prior to the first menses. So the more bone mineral density we have, the more we have to lose as we age. As the osteoblast activity begins to decline as we age. We know that about 90% of our bone density is developed by the age of 18. So if your bone mineral density isn't built up early, you're ending up having to play catch up, and that's a lot harder as we get older. And it's also, a matter now you have to manage your decline much more sensitively because we don't have as much that we can lose from. And so it's important to remember that bones are living tissue. They're responsive to load. They're responsive to the nutrition that we get or don't get, and they're also responsive to hormones. And so what we do early in life is going to establish the habits and the structure that is either going to make or break our bones, pun intended there, as we age.
All right, so what's getting in the way of kids building strong bones today?
Well, I think a lot of it's pretty obvious. Kids are sitting on their butt a lot more now than they did decades ago. Their lives have been taken over by screen time. They're spending a lot more time on computers. They're spending a lot more time, scrolling on their phones. Especially since COVID, there's been a lot more, kids interacting via the internet as opposed to kind of face to face. You're not walking or biking over to your friend's house anymore. You're just getting on your computer and interacting with them. We also live in a very frightened society these days, and kids aren't playing outdoors. I grew up in an era in the 60s and 70s where parents kicked you out of the house. You weren't supposed to come home until, it was dinner time. And even then, our parents would be calling for us and we pretend not to hear our moms so that we can keep playing. And oftentimes we were told, don't come home until the streetlights come on. I know that sounds harsh. And I think the younger generation now is like, oh, your parents were so mean to you. They didn't care about you. And it was very much the opposite. They wanted us outside. They wanted us to get as much activity as possible. And there's a lot less free movement and physical variety in kids. Even if they're getting adequate PE in school, they're not getting as much movement as they should. And, you look at recess time in schools, they're not forcing kids to be outside and just simply playing. We didn't have phones with us or other things that we could do during recess time. We had the monkey bars that were over the asphalt, and, you played and you played hard during that period of time. We got to school early, we'd play. So kids have a lot less variety in their physical activity. They're not moving as much. They're discouraged from moving. And there's also this continued fear and misinformation about kids doing strength training. And I would also say that early sports specialization doesn't necessarily help the problem either. These kids are playing their sports a lot more. They're playing a singular sport a lot more. They're not getting kind of a more balanced strength development, balanced bone development, and they're not getting resistance training activity or conditioning type of activities when all they're doing is playing the same game all the time.
That is really interesting. So it's almost like you're suggesting instead of going down one path, have them be involved in as many sports as possible to experience as much movement, different varieties of movement as possible, because that helps with that development versus this one sport, hyper focus, just training that way.
It's not like that's exactly what I'm proposing.
No, it's interesting. I also think it's really interesting. I could not agree with you that we live in hyper a hyper fearful society. I know, like, I have a lot of friends roughly my age, and when we were younger, we would go bike riding as well, but they don't want their kids to go bike riding at the same age that we were because they're afraid of all kinds of stuff. And even getting their kids involved in sports, I've heard some of my friends and loved ones say, like, oh, I don't want them to experience this sport because I don't want them to experience the culture of that. And I'm like, what? Like, that's such a weird concept for me. But I guess it does play a factor of getting kids involved and getting them active. That's just something I noticed. So I think it's really cool that you brought that up and kind of recognized that fearful culture that we kind of live in today's day and age as well.
Well, and what you mentioned about not wanting them to experience that culture, well, what are you doing about that culture?
Right.
Why don't you step up and be a coach? Why don't you involve yourself in that sport, communicate with the coaches and stand to the negative culture? I remember, there were times when my son was playing football that I literally went up to the coaches after practice and said, we're done because this is bullshit. I'm not going to have, and usually, the coaches backpedal and eventually, you kind of get some change in there or, okay, well, the kid doesn't like that sport. They've tried it. They can move on to something else. But there is strong evidence that, it's more detrimental to a child to specialize in a sport before the age of 12 than it is beneficial for them. And so many of these parents, I think parents are the problem with the culture as well.
Yes.
So many of these parents think that by their kid participating in the club sport that they're going to, you spend tens of thousands of dollars a year to get your kid a scholarship that is going to be less than that for 4 years. It makes absolutely no sense other than maybe you are boosting your own insecurities by, living vicariously through your child.
So what are some kind of activities that actually help build bone density in kids?
Well, it goes back to Wolff's Law, which I'm sure you hopefully remember from your anatomy and physiology days and certainly from physiology of exercise. But Wolff's Law basically states that a bone is going to develop or harden itself in response to the stresses applied to it. And so the more weight-bearing activity that we're doing, activities that provide some level of impact and resistance are going to be the best activities for bone development. So this is going to be, again, weight-bearing exercises, just simply walking, running, doing those types of things, but activities like jumping, sprinting, climbing, lifting, anything where the muscle is having to contract against the bone is going to have the benefit of putting down more bone mineral in the area where that muscle attaches to the bone. And as well, the load as the body is receiving the impact due to gravity is going to help strengthen that bone. And so body weight exercises, gymnastics are great activities for young kids, calisthenics, even just free play. Getting out and playing like kids naturally want to play is going to have a benefit of increasing bone mineral density. And so we want to load the skeleton in a variety of different ways and in progressive ways. We don't want to overload the bone too quickly. You're not going to put a 500-pound barbell on the back of your 12-year-old and say, okay, squat it, because you're going to break the bones. And you run that risk of damaging the bone in the process. And I know that's one of the biggest concerns, and it's a misapplied concern with resistance training in prepubescent kids or kids who have not completed their long bone growth, is that they're going to damage the epiphyseal plate. And the epiphyseal plate is the area in the bone where the long bone grows. And yes, if that gets damaged, it's going to inhibit the long bone development for a period of time until that cartilage heals. And cartilage heals much slower than bone. But the reality is, if a child is training under the appropriate loads, with appropriate technique, under the appropriate supervision, that risk of damaging the epiphyseal plate is negligible. There's just no chance of that. It really comes down to just stupid training, doing stupid things in the gym that would cause somebody to hurt that. The benefits of doing that resistance training far, far outweigh any of the risks that can come from it. And so the important idea with loading the bone in prepubescent kids is doing consistent activity, progressing that over time, maintaining technique as we load the bone, but doing as much activity that is going to impact the bone development as possible. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
As you were bringing up Wolf's Law and asking if I remember it from, over 10 years ago, I started thinking about it. And the one thing I definitely remember from that course and that subject is we studied gymnasts, and their bone density was higher than the average athlete. So that is the one thing I do remember from you teaching Wolf's Law. And so I think it is important, those calisthenics, body weight, gymnastics style exercise, if we want to increase the bone density, just based off of what was taught in that moment, the data was very clear that gymnasts had an insane amount of bone density. Pretty cool. That always stuck with me. So one thing though, not just calisthenics, but strength training in general. Strength training still gets a really bad rap when it comes to kids. I guess the question is it safe? And what do parents need to know when they're having their kids perform strength training?
Well, I think the important thing to know is, A, it needs to be supervised. B, it needs to be age appropriate. I've always taught that resistance training, and it's important that we kind of differentiate. Strength training can come in a lot of different forms. Weight training is just one way that we can train the strength and the bone mineral density of a child. Any kind of resistance movement is going to benefit the muscle and the bone. And so I've always taught that resistance training should start as soon as that child pops out of the womb. It's as soon as you're born, you should be doing things that are going to be loading the muscle. And you think about it, when you play with a baby, you grab their feet, they're immediately and just intuitively going to push against your hands. That's resistance training. And so the last thing we want to do with a newborn is swaddle them up in a blanket and leave them in a crib for long periods of time, because they're not going to develop. We want them crawling. We want them climbing. We want them falling. We want them to be moving so that they can develop naturally. And so just getting kids moving is going to be the first step. And then as a child gets older, resistance training doesn't have to be weights. It could begin to be just body weight, calisthenics types of movements, doing push-ups, pull-ups, climbing the ropes in PE, jumping, running, doing those types of activities are going to help. And then eventually we can begin to introduce weight training to the developing child. And there's no age that is not ideal. It really depends on the child. I know, my friend Corey Metzger, who's the strength and conditioning coach at Western Oregon University, her daughter Reba has pretty much grown up in the weight room, and she will just naturally pick up weights and start doing the stuff that the athletes are doing. That's not Corey pushing it on her or any of that kind of stuff. It's just kid experiences it. They get interested in it. They try it. They might do it for a while and then lose interest. So you just let them do what interests them. And as they express that interest, then support that interest. If they want to start lifting weights, start teaching them the technique. Teach them the basic 5 movement patterns. Teach them how to do a proper squat. Teach them how to do a hip hinge. Teach them how to, doing a push-up is going to teach them how to bench press. You're doing that horizontal push, doing overhead movement, doing pulls, doing a lot of carries. Get your kid carrying the groceries in from the car.
Yeah.
They might only be able to carry a small bag at a time, but you start adding more and more groceries over time, that kid is going to get stronger. They're going to be able to do more work. And so as long as they can execute the movement patterns in proper technique under an appropriate load and do it with interest, then let them lift. If they're not interested, don't force them. If they're not of the emotional maturity to be able to train, they just want to play grab ass in the gym all the time, that's not benefiting them. So you want to be doing it in a way that's most supervised and most age appropriate. And really, when we're looking at resistance training, the risk of injury is dramatically lower than it is in most sports. And by doing resistance training, you are going to reduce the risk of injury in those sports. You look at the risk of ACL tears in females. Once they hit puberty, their hips start to widen, their Q angle in the legs starts to change, and their risk of an ACL tear increases with every year of development. And if they don't have strong hips, that risk is going to continue to increase. But if we're strengthening the hips, they're able to do that movement without, they're able to jump, they're able to land with a much reduced risk of ACL tear or injury. And so there's so many benefits other than just stronger, more aesthetic muscles in children, in stronger bones. There's improved coordination. They have better posture. They have better injury resistance, as I mentioned, and confidence. If you are stronger than the kids around you, you're going to have more confidence in so many different things. And that's going to carry over beyond just sports, beyond even, school performance and things like that. You're going to be more confident socially. You're going to be more confident in your ability to perform and interact with other people. There's just so many benefits that come with resistance training. But again, the main focus has to be on technique, variety, but again, not an excessive amount of variety. I think that concept of muscle confusion and never doing the same thing is really, really the wrong approach for kids. You want to keep those movement patterns very basic. Teach them how to squat. Maybe it's doing a goblet squat or even just a body weight squat until they have that technique down perfectly. You don't need to be doing a bunch of different types of squats. You don't have to be doing different types of deadlifts or bench pressing. Get them to learn the technique. And then once the technique is mastered, begin to add weight, begin to add some variety. But the biggest thing is keep it fun, and don't do max lifts. Don't encourage kids to be lifting for appearance. One of the biggest issues I have with training adolescents, particularly adolescent males, is the first thing they're going to want to do when they go into the gym is bicep curls and bench press, because somewhere along the line they learn that having a strong bench press and having big biceps is the key to performance. And those are like the last muscles I would work in young kids. I would primarily focus on, doing a squatting motion, doing a deadlifting motion, doing pulls, because that's going to affect posture. It's going to affect their ability to be able to lift heavier benches because they have a stronger shoulder structure in order to be able to support those heavier weights. And so don't do 1 repetition maximums. They don't need to be ever doing that unless they absolutely need to do that. If you're going to be a power lifter, then maybe you have to start working toward max lifts, or an Olympic lifter, but nobody needs to be comparing their bench press, their squat with somebody else before their bone structure has completely developed, because you're going to have injury.
So I just kind of want to add in on that, but I think by teaching kids proper technique at such a young age could really, really benefit in the long run, because then they're going to get that muscle motor connection with the actual movement itself, because their body's they're so new and they're going to become used to that movement, and that movement's going to be a secondary nature. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach a kid how to squat and then try to teach a fully grown adult how to squat. That person has never squatted a day in their life, but the kid, it just perfect technique almost happens instantaneously because it's something new, it's something exciting, versus an adult, they're like, oh, that stiffness is coming. The adult kind of overthinks it a little bit, but if you can start at a young age and just have that movement just become natural, really think it pays off in the end. So I completely agree with you on that, Dr. Armstrong. I also, you mentioned earlier that when an infant is a newborn, we kind of play around with their arms and stuff, and that starts that process of resistance training. That opened up a memory that when I was in college, I can't remember what course it was, but they actually handed out a little piece of paper of what weeks to start implementing, like bringing the leg back closer to the head and having it stretch out, and taking the arms and moving them out, and then poking the palms and having the grip, and all of that helps with that motor development, and that can be a form of resistance training at such a young age. And I completely forgot about that until you brought that up. So I think to answer our question, we don't need to complicate resistance training with infants. It's little tiny things. I loved your example with the groceries. Not only is it teaching kids resistance, but it's also building that confidence as well, because they're like, all right, mom wants me to help bring in the groceries. Here you go, mom. And then if mom's like, wow, you're so strong, it makes the kid, it gives that positive feedback to, I want to keep doing that. And it kind of just, I don't know. I think that's really cool. I loved everything that you had to say on that. So thank you. I really appreciate that. I kind of want to dive into food because we know that has to do with bone density. So let's talk food, and what role does nutrition play in developing strong bones early on?
Well, I mean, anybody that's aware of what rickets is knows how important nutrition is for bone development. And even, when the nutrients are there, our ability to utilize the nutrients, is important for bone development, because there are people in the United States that still get rickets. It's more of a genetic predisposition to that, and it might entail poor absorption of calcium and vitamin D. But, key nutrients are anything that is going to be a constituent of bone and muscle tissue. And so getting adequate calcium, getting vitamin D, and vitamin D, we really want to consider the source of vitamin D and how our bodies utilize those sources. And supplemental vitamin D is not going to be as effective as vitamin D that is formed naturally in our tissue in response to sun exposure. And so getting kids outside with moderate levels of protection against the ultraviolet rays is going to be very important to that bone mineral density. And so we tend to overprotect kids. We also have to be aware that overindulgence in sunscreens is going to limit that vitamin D synthesis. And so we want to take a really good balanced approach to exposure to the sun to be able to stimulate vitamin D production. But getting calcium, getting the minerals like magnesium and phosphorus, we tend to ignore those. And we know magnesium and phosphorus can very easily be deficient in kids. And so getting a diet that is rich in magnesium and phosphorus, even potassium, those types of things, but also protein, getting adequate protein in the diet for development. It doesn't matter whether it's animal-based or plant-based. Getting the appropriate amount of protein for a developing kid is going to be critical. And so making sure they're getting good sources, good quality food, whether plant-based or animal-based, that are going to give them the amino acids that their muscles need, their bones need to be able to develop. So we want to, when we're talking nutrition in kids, this is a challenge in our generation, but we have to be really trying to focus more on whole foods over supplementation unless the kid is deficient. So don't just assume that a kid is deficient in calcium, vitamin D, magnesium, phosphorus. They don't necessarily have to load them up on milk or those types of things, or foods that are supplemented with these minerals if we are getting good whole foods. If you're concerned that they are deficient, get them checked. Physician can easily check for blood levels of calcium and vitamin D and magnesium and so on. But really focus on good quality, balanced, whole foods. And that's going to set them up for a lifetime of eating well to be able to maintain their bone mineral density. And then remember that gut health matters. So, think about what's going to promote absorption, what's going to maybe promote inflammation. So eating, again, a healthy, whole food, plant-based type of approach is going to have an impact on their overall bone formation. Eating a lot of ultra-processed foods, drinking a lot of soda, or eating foods that have a low mineral content, those are things that are going to really negatively affect the kid's bone mineral density. Probably one of the worst things that we do to our children is introduce them to soda or pop, because kids start drinking pop early on. And I made this mistake. I allowed my kids to start drinking pop, and, they drink too much of it. Again, that's kind of how I was raised. Pop was so readily available and it tastes so good to kids. And so that's what they want to drink. They don't want to drink water because pop is so much better. And so avoid the very ultra processed foods, avoid drinking canned beverages and things that are coming out of the inner aisles of the grocery store. Introduce them to good produce, whole grains, to rather than processed cereal in a box. Get them eating oats and barley and healthy grains for breakfast, as opposed to sugared fruit circle, highly colored crap food and donuts and all that other kind of junk that we tend to feed kids.
So, Dr. Armstrong, now I know you're not a nutritionist, but I feel like you have a good concept of this subject. And also, after interviewing on this podcast people that specialize in nutrition, can you just provide the listeners some examples of specific whole foods that you would recommend for either your kids or yourself if you wanted to increase that bone density? Not just a broad statement of protein, but like a specific example, so our listeners can hear it and say, okay, I'm just going to add that little bit to my diet.
I don't think that's appropriate for me to answer, because we have viewers and listeners that are across the globe. Mm-hmm. And so seasonally, regionally, there are going to be different foods accessible to us. And so, and we have different tastes as well. I mean, broccoli is a great thing that I would recommend, because there's so much good nutrients in broccoli, but not everybody likes broccoli. So I would just narrow it down to fresh, whole fruits and vegetables, high in fiber, brightly colored, so try and get the color spectrum. You have yellows and reds and blues and purples in your food. The more color variety that you're getting in your vegetables, the more likely you are to be getting all of the nutrients and the phytochemicals in the foods that are going to promote absorption and give us the best bang for the buck. And so you want to get a lot of healthy greens, whether it's leafy greens or, your broccolis, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. I mean, what vegetable are you going to get your kid to eat? And encourage them to eat what are good, healthy vegetables. If they like something and it's healthy, then keep them eating that, and slowly be able to introduce or sway them towards the things that they are less likely to like. Don't kind of swim your vegetables in butter and sauces in order to get the kid to like them, or don't fry them in order to get them to like them. Introduce them in a way that the kid is going to get the vegetables in ways that they're going to enjoy them, and begin to advance and favor those vegetables in other ways. I mean, I grew up, I hated Brussels sprouts. Now I love them, partly because I know how healthy Brussels sprouts are. It just took some years of, being forced to eat them, and, maybe not enjoying them as much, and just having to try them a little bit, and then beginning to experiment in them a little bit more. Asparagus is probably another vegetable. It's really hard for kids to kind of get their head around early. I think eggplant was another one that my mom used to make eggplant parmesan all the time. And I didn't like it as much when I was a kid, but now I love it. And so don't avoid exposure to these, and don't force kids to eat the vegetables that they don't like, because that builds up those barriers to them enjoying them later on in life. But try and just get as much variety as possible. Try and do it in their whole fashion as opposed to a processed fashion for those vegetables. But start with what they're going to eat, and don't worry about whether it is the healthiest of vegetables. Worry about building a habit of eating vegetables and, trying to get them eating the right greens. Don't feed your kid iceberg lettuce salads like our schools do. Try and get them exposed to romaine lettuce or, some of the greener leafy vegetables. You might not get them to jump right into kale, but it may be eventually you start getting a little bit of kale in with that spinach or with that, that romaine lettuce, and they start to acquire a taste for it. And so do it progressively. Maybe you sneak it in other ways. You can sneak some of those vegetables and fruits in smoothies for your kid and just get them experiencing a wide range of vegetables. Reward them for trying vegetables as opposed to penalizing them for not trying them. And then as you start looking at fruits, what are seasonal fruits that they're going to eat? Try and focus a lot more on berries. And most kids love berries. I don't think there's any problem with getting kids eating berries. So get them eating more fruit. When it comes to grains, most grains are not an acquired taste. We just tend to get these kids introduced to sugary cereals, and then they get addicted to the sugar in the cereal, and that's all they want. And another good way to keep your kid from wanting to eat a lot of box cereals, turn off the TV. Because I found with my kids, they didn't want sugary cereals until they saw commercials. And when we spent most of our kids' years, we had cable, but they did a lot more on-demand TV. And it wasn't until they watched regular TV and saw commercials that they're like, I want that. I need that. They never asked for things. And so disconnecting the cable, avoiding commercials, you're going to avoid a big fight with your kid over sugary cereals.
Yeah, I mean, smart. I actually knew someone, and how she got her kid to eat vegetables, she would take like spinach or broccoli or whatever and chop it up really, really fine and throw it in the spaghetti sauce. And you couldn't even tell. It made no difference in flavor at all. And you're probably thinking, oh, that's probably really bad. There was no difference in flavor. And the kid he hated vegetables, but man, he loved that spaghetti sauce. And so it was kind of like a good way to trick him, but he was still getting all the nutrition he needs. Before we move forward, I just have one question about vitamin D. We both know that it is ideal to get vitamin D through natural sunlight. But what would you recommend for an individual who, say, lives in an area like we do here in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in the Willamette Valley, where there's a lot of rain? What would you say that someone that lives in a high concentrated area of cloudy, overcast, and rain and doesn't really get to see the sun that often, what would you recommend to get that vitamin D source, which is crucial for bone health?
Get outside. I mean, this notion that because it's a little gray outside, we're not getting the sun is just pure BS. I mean, it's okay. Yeah, you're not getting direct rays of the sun. You're actually probably getting better sunlight because you're not getting the direct ultraviolet rays from the sun. And you might have to spend a little bit more time outside, but get your ass outside and move out. If it's not pitch black outside, the sun is shining. The sun's rays are making it to the surface of this earth. They are making it to your skin. Your body is going to make the adaptations to convert the cholesterol in your skin to vitamin D. And so it might be a little bit harder to get as much vitamin D synthesis in, a cloudy area, whether you're living in the Pacific Northwest or you're living in the UK or other areas that are notorious for being cloudy and dark. And actually, the Pacific Northwest isn't as dark and as gray as
it once was.
The people in the Pacific Northwest like to think it is. There are places in the Midwest that get far more gray throughout the year than they do here. And even if it's raining, I mean, I've experienced times here where I've walked out, like years ago when my classroom was underneath the bleachers of the stadium at Western Oregon University, no windows in the classroom. And we'd walk out after class and it's raining. But, you open the door and you see this blue skies and rain pouring down. It's like we're still getting sunlight
Right.
during the rain. And it's filtering through those clouds. So there's getting outside during daylight hours is going to give you some benefit in terms of synthesizing your vitamin D. And, if you are concerned that you're getting enough, get tested before supplementation, because we don't need to supplement if we don't need to supplement.
I guess I agree with you. I think people should get out. But if it gets absorbed through sunlight through the skin, I feel like a factor of it not being absorbed as much when it's raining is typically when it rains, people like to wear long sleeves and that's less sun exposure. You only got your hands and your face. And so I don't know. That might throw a factor into it, but I don't know that we could probably talk about that on another podcast episode.
Well, I mean, again, the more you're outside, the more you're getting exposed to sunlight. And it's not raining all the time here. I mean, and you're not always covered in long, thick sleeves. And so just be cognizant of the fact you need to get outside more and you're going to get more of that exposure. I mean, we had millennia of people who did fine without running around and going to tanning booths or taking supplementation to get their vitamin D. So I don't think it's as worrisome as we tend to think. And if we're eating foods that are naturally higher in vitamin D, we're going to be getting vitamin D synthesis as well.
So back to the importance of bone health. Let's just connect this all back to aging well. Why does all of this matter in our 30s, our 40s, and even as we enter our 60s? Why? Why does it matter?
Well, because we know that bone mass is going to decline with age. And after about the age of 30, we see that decline start to accelerate. And the more bone mass that somebody has to start, the more they have to lose, and they're going to lose it more slowly, especially if they're physically active and remain physically active. And so the more bone mineral density that we can maintain over time, the less prone we are to fractures. And stronger bones also mean we're less likely to fall. And there's some indication that a lot of times seniors who fall and break a hip, it was actually the broken hip that caused the fall, not the fall that caused the broken hip. And so it is critical that we first off limit osteopenia. So osteopenia is bone mineral loss that is pre-pathologic. It's not, when it's osteoporosis means it's pathologic. That's where you're going to have hip fractures and bone breaking much more readily. The bone is so fragile. You start seeing in the older population starting to lose height, and maybe they become more kyphotic because gravity acting on those weaker bones start to kind of crush the bones a little bit. And so under the weight of the body, they tend to collapse a bit. And so we lose height. That's osteoporosis. Osteopenia is just that natural loss that we have over time. We're all going to experience a certain amount of osteopenia, but the more active we are, the more reserves that we have available to us, the less likely we are to see that osteopenia reach any level of significance. And so if we have strong bones, we're more mobile, we're more independent, we're going to have more confidence as we age. If I have strong bones, I'm not afraid to go out and do more intensive physical activity because I'm not worried about breaking a hip. If I have very fragile bones, and there are people who have fragile bones pathologically from a young age that also have to be more aware of the activities that they're doing, the more I can move, the more I'm willing to move, and the less likely I am to see loss in bone mineral density as I age, and the healthier I'm going to be. And so, longevity is great. We can live for 120 years, but if we can't live actively and we can't live functionally, then what's the whole purpose? And I always go back to the movie WALL-E. If you saw that movie where I guess Earth becomes so inhabitable that the people of Earth kind of go up into these spaceships, and there's like 500 years living on these spaceships that are kind of orbiting the Earth. And over time, the population becomes less and less active. They're kind of moving around on those scooters like you see at the Walmart, kind of with their computer screens on there, controlling everything. They've become morbidly obese and inactive, and they learn that Earth is now inhabitable again. So they go back to Earth, they land the ship on the surface of the Earth, and they all get up and they walk out of that spaceship onto the surface of Earth. There is no way that a population that has been that inactive and is that morbidly obese, carrying that much excess body fat relative to probably almost no muscle mass, because they've been scooting around on those little scooters for their entire life, and generations doing that, because 500 years, how many generations you can have in 500 years? There is no way their bone mineral density is going to be strong enough to be able to support the amount of weight that they were carrying. So as soon as they would stand up, the body would just collapse under the crushing effect of that weight on the bone. So that movie always bothered me when it gets to that point. I mean, it bothered me that they're just scooting around rather than actually moving. But the fact that we're not getting activity is going to cause us to have even weaker bones that aren't going to be able to support any kind of activity. So it is hugely important for us not only to be physically active in our teen years, but to maintain that level of activity throughout our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, because that's going to help us to maintain our bone mineral density. And that's what's going to help us prevent osteoporosis.
Okay, so you've talked before about movement, obviously, as a formation, not just fitness. So how does it show up here?
Well, movement, again, we tend to think movement is, only fitness. And this is where, a poor history of physical activity, physical education, all that kind of things can really impact us over the long haul. We're not training to be fit as children. We're training for function. We're training to develop and shape our bodies and our systems to be resilient, to be free of disease, to have strong immune systems, to have the bone mineral density that is going to sustain us for a long life. We're also training for improved neuromuscular coordination, to have confidence, to have better postural integrity. So this goes back to the whole idea of, movement, exercise, all the things that we do for aging well comes back to the biomechanical psychosocial. So all that movement that we're doing is not only impacting our continued ability to move and to have movement that is going to keep us injury free, but it also gives us the confidence and the intention to be socially active, to be confident. That confidence is going to carry over into our income as we age, because the more confident somebody is, the more fit they are, the more hireable they are, the more promotable they are. We know that people fitter, athletic, healthier individuals are going to make more income over the course of their life than somebody who is much more frail, out of shape, overweight, and those types of things. And so there are so many different aspects that play into this. It's more about stewardship of the body than it is about sports performance, because very rarely beyond the age of probably 20 are any of us going to be really participating in competitive athletics. We might be playing, big thing now is pickleball in my generation. And we're athletes now because we're in our 60s and we play pickleball. And you're not really an athlete, you're just physically active. But the more physically active, the more activities that we can do, the better the quality of life, the better the longevity of life, the better the health span, and just the more we're going to be able to do and accomplish in whatever number of years we have on this earth.
What would one thing that you want our listeners to take away from this episode?
Well, I think the biggest thing is what we do for our kids now is literally going to build their future body. So when we're prohibiting our kids from getting outside, playing, and we think we're keeping them safe, we're probably doing them far more harm. We know that strong bones are going to lead to strong, resilient lives, but we have to start early. We can't expect kids to, once they leave the home, they're going to start going to the gym, they're going to start exercising, they're going to start lifting weights. We got to start them early. And I'm not opposed to resistance training in younger people. Get them started when they're young. Good way to start them is with machines because it is a little bit safer and they can learn the basic movements as a muscle contracts. But get kids active early, get them outside playing, get them involved in sports, even if it's just doing kind of a basic gymnastics course where you're not planning on them competing, you're not anticipating them becoming, the next Olympic gold medalist. Get them to be able to move in a way that's going to help their bodies develop more effectively. And for adults, it's not too late to strengthen what supports you. So even if you've missed that optimal window, you weren't active as a child, you can begin to get active no matter what your age is. Even if you're well into your 80s, you're going to do your bones a benefit by getting much more active later on in life. And so if you're a parent, look at your child's week. Are they loading their bones regularly? Are they doing that with movement, play, strength training? If you're an adult, ask yourself the same question. Are you maintaining the bone mineral density that you have built up in your youth, or are you neglecting that foundation of aging well?
So I think in summary, in order to maintain proper bone health, it starts when you're young. Add the resistance with your infants by moving their hands and their feet and just getting that resistance at a young age. And as the child develops and they get a little older, just introduce them to helping you out with the groceries. Something super simple. Don't be fearful of them being involved in sports and other activities. Expose them to as much physical movement as possible, specifically gymnastics, calisthenics, eventually moving on to resistance and weight training, lighter weight, but proper form and technique. Make sure that you and your child are eating whole foods that are rich in supplements or that are rich in minerals that are designed perfectly to help strengthen bone density. And that can carry on not only in your youth and in your 20s, but in your 30s, your 40s, up to your 60s. And by doing so and just getting outside and absorbing as much sunlight, this not only will help you with your bone density and prevent osteoporosis, but it'll also help you age well.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.